Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly down a cold stone corridor where candle flames lean like eavesdroppers and the air smells faintly of beeswax, thyme and damp linen. You trail your fingers along the wall's bite-mark texture, listening to the soft clatter of wooden ladles and the murmur of Latin you almost recognise from nowhere in particular. This is the doorway you shouldn't open and absolutely will the infirmary of a medieval monastery, half chapel, half clinic, where sleep is medicine and prayer is dosage. Little warning, before we tuck you in, if you are actually sick in this century, you probably won't survive this, statistically speaking. So we're just visiting, keeping our hands inside the tapestry at all times. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is on your clock right now. I love seeing the map light up. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You nudge the door with your knuckles and step into honeyed illumination tapers blinking along a beam, a crucifix casting a long slender shadow, rows of beds curtained in faded greens and browns. Linen hangs like sails at rest. The healer, the infirmary, a monk with hands that look carved by wind, meets you with a nod that says, "Hush, the night is already working." He moves with the confidence of someone who has tucked in 1,000 strangers and still remembers who needed extra straw under the shoulder. You follow him past a brazier where an iron pot whispers. In it a broth climbs slowly toward usefulness, onions leak parsley, a thumb of sage and something you can't name that smells like a wet meadow just after rain. "Balance," he murmurs almost to himself, and you catch the headline of the age bodies are weather, and the doctor is trying to forecast. He shows you a shelf of tools that aren't quite terrifying yet: mortars, pestles, a small knife with a dove-shaped handle, bundles of dried herbs tied with a red thread. The physic garden sleeps outside in the square of moonlight, mint and rue yarrow, and plantains scribbled into neat beds like the margins of a manuscript. Here the mainstream fact leans plainly on the table: monasteries all across Christendom keep infirmaries, sometimes with their own kitchens and gardens, because caring for the sick is written into holy routine. You don't need the Latin to feel it. But he hums something about the rule saying, "The sick are to be served before all." And because the sick do not keep banker's hours, you're awake. You stand beside a bed where a visitor coughs with a sound like a cupboard door refusing to close. The monk ladles broth into a cup, not too hot, not too thin. Goldilocksing centuries before children's stories get standardized, and slips in a pinch of ground pepper. "Warming," he says, for cold humours, and you nod as if this isn't the same advice your grandmother gives when she endorses soup as a universal patch for human sadness. The curtain sways, another patient mutters into sleep. Somewhere a bell tests the air with a single note. By the head of the bed hangs a tiny glazed flask, pear-shaped, the colour of weak tea. A uroscopy flask, the monk explains, for studying what the body exclaims when words fail. You try not to stare at the shelf where 3 more sit in a patient queue like lanterns waiting for their wicks. He swirls one, watching how the liquid clings and clears, then compares it to a painted wheel tucked into a vellum book. You've seen worse at a wine tasting. The quirky tidbit arrives like a wink. Some healers, he confides, will touch a drop to the tongue, just a touch to guess at sweetness that shouldn't be there. You decide that if anyone tries that with your sample, you're switching monasteries. Light joke 1 achieved. You keep a straight face because this is a church. The infirmary offers you a warmed stone wrapped in cloth, the medieval equivalent of an electric blanket with better battery life. He tucks it near the visitor's feet, then traces a small cross with chalk on the bedhead, an old habit that blends care with comfort. He rubs rosemary between his fingers until the room smells like open countryside. This is where the medicine feels like housekeeping, and the housekeeping feels like love. Historians still argue whether places like this were more hospital or hostel, whether the care was primarily spiritual with a garnish of remedies, or whether the practical knowledge rivaled what you'd find in any town doctor's bag. You watch the monk move, and for a moment the debate quiets. Whatever this is, it's careful. Your guide seats you on a wooden bench and pours a little cup from the pot that hasn't stopped whispering. You sip, it's politely bland, and he shows you a folded amulet with lines of text, not quite a spell and not quite a psalm, one of those hybrid comforts people tuck under pillows. There's a tiny bag of dried violet flowers too, for syrup against a scratchy throat. He reminds you in that voice like a soft broom that sleep itself treats more than half the ward. You believe him because the room is doing its best lullaby impression, and also because you have never felt so ready to nap on furniture designed to punish the spine. Light joke 2. Medieval furniture sponsored by penance. A sister from the kitchen pads in with trenchers and a clay jug, leaving behind the ghost of baking bread that plays very unfairly with your restraint. Someone whispers a prayer at the foot of a bed. Someone else snores in a way that could be catalogued as a small storm. The monk glances at a chart scratched with lunar symbols and feast days. Nothing too exotic tonight, he assures you, just watching for critical days when a fever may turn. He shrugs like a man who has argued with the moon and agreed to disagree. You tuck that note in your sleeve for later when the stars will have their say. He opens a chest to show you tidy rolls of bandage, a pot of honey that glows like a second candle. You know antiseptic before antiseptic has a name, and a wad of very clean cobwebs. Yes, cobwebs. He grins because your eyebrows lift. Pressed over a cut, he says they help it dry and knit spider silk as a band-aid with better marketing. You file that under things you didn't come expecting to respect and try not to imagine the procurement process. Like joke 3, we ran out. Brother Thomas fetched the ladder. We ran. There's a bed closer to the window where a young novice lies with a wrapping of mashed plantain leaves over an angry red line, perhaps a cut earned while learning humility with a scythe. The monk replaces the poultice and the room breathes around him. He doesn't rush. He explains nothing you can't understand. He suggests that tomorrow, if the fever holds back, there will be a little wine warmed with cinnamon. In the corner, a small reliquary winks in the candlelight, less a promise than a reminder that hope comes in many packaging sizes. You notice a wooden screen separating a narrower row of pallets, where travellers sometimes collapse with road-stiff limbs. Hospitality is part of the brief. The gatehouse sends them here when the cough sounds unfriendly. That's your second mainstream fact in a quieter register. Monastic houses serve strangers, pilgrims, the poor and the sick in the same breath, because the line between them is mostly bookkeeping. Under the screen, a cat drifts like smoke proof that even centuries ago clinical governance valued pest control. Your guide pauses by the door and gestures toward the world outside the town, sleeping like a loaf under a cloth, the river keeping its secrets, the night that will always be colder just before it turns into morning. He tells you there are other treatments you'll see if you keep pace. Sleepy sponges steeped in wine river leeches, with trust issues masks that make doctors look like they're auditioning for bird roles. He says it gently, not to frighten you, but to promise variety. This is a tour, not a sentencing. And still you shiver a little because even candlelight has its predators. Before you go, he threads a sprig of rue through your sleeve, a tiny green password against whatever prowls the damp. You memorize the layout, the broth, the flasks, the garden door, because you have the sense you'll be back here after other experiments go enthusiastically sideways. The bell trembles once more like a finger drawn round the rim of a bowl. Somewhere under the bed's the cat's eyes. You step into the corridor and the candle flame near the door dips, nodding like a host who knows when to let guests wander. You leave the warm hush of the infirmary and follow the monk into a side room where 4 strips of dyed cloth hang from a peg like flags at a miniature tournament. Red, white, yellow, black. He taps each with a careful finger. Blood phlegm, yellow, bile, black, bum, bile, and tells you this is the weather inside you, the currents that set your mood, your appetite, even the shine of your skin. Bodies, he says, are little climates with their own springs and droughts. The idea isn't fringe. In his world, it's the operating system inherited from Galen and copied into university texts from Salerno to Paris, where future physicians learn to read people like seasons and storms. You're not a patient so much as a forecast. He empties a basket of vegetables, leeks, turnips, onions onto the table and sets beside them wooden tokens painted hot or cold, wet or dry. Food becomes sermon. If you are too cold and wet, phlegmatic winter in the bones, then spices, roasted meats and mustardy sauces promise a nudge toward warmth and dryness. If you're hot and dry, think summer and collar, then lettuce, cucumbers and barley pottage slide you back from tinderbox to temperate. He isn't guessing. This is textbook material, the practical hand of dietetics that runs through medieval medicine like a steady baseline. You learn quickly that dinner here is a prescription written in steam. He ladles you a modest bowl of pottage and places a pinch of ginger on your tongue, explaining that every meal is microsurgery. You aren't just eating, you're brokering a peace treaty among 4 moody roommates. For purging excess, he shows gentler tools first, a tisane of senna, a dram of rhubarb, dried figs for the stubborn. Then your eyes settle on a clister syringe leaning in the corner, with the innocent look of an instrument that has changed lives and not always for the better. You decide emphatically that your humours would prefer diplomacy to invasion. Light joke 1. On a shelf next to jars of pepper and cumin sits a small clay pot labelled theriac, a complex jam of dozens of ingredients. Opium spices, sometimes even viper's flesh in the deluxe editions marketed as a panacea. He opens it. The scent is dark and sticky like a spice market whispered through a cellar. One tiny dab on the tongue fortifies the heart, he claims, and to be fair, the drama alone does something. Apothecaries weigh it like gold and patrons brag about their supply. Historians still argue whether theriac truly medicated, merely soothed, or mostly signalled that you could afford a fashionable cure. You let it sit on your tongue and taste the price of hope. Sickness, he says, is a leaning. Treatment is leaning back. That's why bloodletting sits so confidently in the chair by the window. When spring winds stir and bodies surge with heat and moisture, a barber surgeon opens a vein to take the edge off measured ounces, carefully timed hours, selected veins for selected complaints. He unfolds a chart pricked with tiny red dots along a painted arm, the famous phlebotomy man. And yes, the striped pole outside the barber's shop advertises this very service, the world's most ominous candy cane. Light joke 2. The mainstream fact here is, plain bleeding is not a stunt, but a central therapy planned with almost bureaucratic precision. The monk demonstrates on a leather bladder, a neat ligature skin warmed with a cloth, a razor as sharp as a vow. The blood imaginary tonight would stream into a bowl inconveniently similar to the one you'd serve cherries in, which is why you quietly resolve to label the kitchenware not for fruit. Light joke 3. Timing matters. He consults a small calendar that frowns at certain days when the moon meddles with tides inside and out. The deeper stargazing will arrive later when astrologers schedule procedures by the sky, he hints, but for now it's enough to avoid a bleed when the body is already ebbing. For less drama and more heat, he shows a brazier and a set of irons with ends shaped like coins, stars and small crescents. Cautery, he says, sealing vessels, drawing off excess through the skin by recruiting fire itself. You taste metal in your imagination. Some swear the hot mark diverts humours from deeper trouble. Others insist it startles illness out the view's door, the way a shout scatters birds. The quirky tidbit arrives bundled in smoke. A few recipe books recommend laying a fresh pigeon split and briefly warmed against the skin near the liver to draw malign heat. You decide not to ask for the avian consent form. He pulls down a parchment listing the 6 non-naturals, the levers of health you actually control: air, food and drink, sleep and waking motion and rest, excretions and retentions, and the passions of the soul. You recognise a medieval wellness checklist wearing sensible clothes. Open the shutters when the air smells honest. Choose warming or cooling foods by season. Walk the cloister if you've sat too long at the scriptorium. Sleep, but not until you forget your own name. Let nature take its course instead of hoarding it. And keep your temper, because fury roils the humours faster than fire under a kettle. It sounds surprisingly modern until you back into the brazier and remember the irons. By the window a narrow bed waits for a feverish child who might be dosed with violet syrup or cooled with linen rinsed in rosewater. If sweating won't break, a little wine stirred with willow bark may ease the ache. You recognise the ancestor of aspirin and feel oddly reassured by the family resemblance. The monk admits a fringe recipe that makes you blink powdered emerald administered, carefully reputed to calm the heart. You ask whether it works. He shrugs like a man who has watched jewels cure wallets more reliably than palpitations, and you both move on. Outside the physics garden breathes mint and rue into the corridor, for phlegm hyssop, for heat endive, for melancholy rose bridge, and a decent story at bedtime note taken. He tells you that if your chest feels heavy and sad, a broth of capon with sage can persuade the black bile to stop narrating your failures. The line between diet and therapy blurs until it becomes supper with purpose. When the head feels stuffed and sluggish, a sneeze coaxed with a feather purges excess brain moisture. You try to keep a straight face, and your nose decides otherwise and offers 2 polite eruptions for science. You remember the honey pot and cobweb bandage from earlier, and realise how many remedies are simply close observation wrapped in ritual. Honey makes wounds sweetly inhospitable. Resting by a warmed stone persuades cold limbs to rejoin the conversation. Broth restores without demanding repayment. Perhaps the grand theory of humours is scaffolding that lets ordinary care climb higher. Historians still argue whether humoralism was a coherent empirical system or a poetic map that bundled good habits into a cosmology populated by colours and seasons. You listen to the brazier tick and decide the theory's real power, at least tonight, is that it gives anxious people something to do with their hands. Before you go, the monk presses a small packet into your palm barley ginger and a scrap of verse from the Regimen of Salerno, the medieval self-help poem that turned practical wisdom into rhyme after dinner, walk a mile drink. Wine in moderation, keep cheerful company. He winks, the brazier sighs, her bell taps midnight into the stones. As you step back into the corridor, the four banners lift in a draft little weather vanes for a climate only you can feel. You're not cured. There was nothing to cure, but you are balanced enough to keep walking soup and steel behind you, the night ahead steady as a heartbeat. You step out into the town's dawn-grey street and follow the clean metal scrape of steel on stone, a sound that tightens every tendon in your forearm. The barber-surgeon's shop yawns open like a cheerful mouth with too many tools. There's the striped pole out front, red spiraled with white twisting slowly in the breeze like an ominous candy cane that's lost the will to be festive. You read the sign without reading red for blood, white for the bandages, and sometimes a brass finial on top said to stand in for the leech jar or basin. Mainstream fact, no sugar coating this fellow, shaves beards, lances, boils, pulls teeth, sets bones and opens veins on purpose. University physicians may own the Latin, the barber owns the razor and the cue. Inside the bench is already occupied by the men with hats in laps and women with lips pinched the way you pinch a pie crust. The air smells of lather lamp oil and a sharper mineral note that your body recognizes without consent. A copper basin glints where the window catches it. This one has tidy gradation lines etched inside so the barber can brag with the data integrity of a pitcher at a tavern that he took exactly 6 ounces, thank you very much. You slide into a chair whose armrests have seen fingers dig small personal glyphs into the wood. The barber smiles with a serenity you associate with people who tie sailing knots for fun. He warms your forearm with a cloth, tests a new edge on the thumb of his other hand, then lays out his kit lancet, small, precise, horrifyingly friendly fleam wider, more decisive, beloved by livestock and the people who build them, and a set of cupping glasses with soot inside their bellies. His patter is soothing, practiced the soft sell of a man who has bled half this parish and sent them home to eat stew with a story. You notice a little book on the shelf, the phlebotomy man again, the illustrated arm pricked with red stars, a constellation you hope never to visit. Today the target is the median cubital vein, easy accessible conversation ready. He says it like he's recommending the soup of the day. Because you've been taught your humour's like weather. It makes a grim kind of sense. Spring rising. Heat stirring you let a little out so the system stops acting like a kettle. He shows you the ligature, a ribbon really loop-tipped above the elbow, until the vein stands up to be counted. A dot of ash marks the spot, a tiny tattoo of intent. He mentions almost lazily that bleeding is timed not after heavy meals, not when the moon is wrong, not if you're already pale as linen. We'll keep it to 8 ounces, he says, or until your ears stop ringing, whichever is friendlier. Light, joke 1, delivered with the bedside manner of man who thinks bells are a unit of measure. On a hook hangs a neat row of pewter bowls shaped like question marks laid on their backs, the classic bleeding basins designed to nest against the elbow. The barber picks one with a rim chip, just enough to plead seniority, and sets it under your arm. His thumb finds your pulse. Steady, he says, like a monk's footfall. You remember the infirmary and the honey and the warm stone that believed in you more than you believed in yourself? Different rooms, same intention, make the body a kinder place to live. Historians still argue whether routine bloodletting actually improved outcomes or whether it mostly offered a controlled ritual that felt like action when time and care were the truer cures. You decide your opinion will form closely around whether you faint. He nicks and the skin sighs. The first thin ribbon finds the curve of the basin. You breathe in the lather scent and out the worry. The barber keeps talking not to distract you, though it works, but to keep the tide even. He tells you about St. Luke's Day discounts, kidding mostly about the time he bled the reeve who swore his headaches were demons and then blamed the barber when the demons grew bored and left. Light joke 2, possession surcharge. He shows a cupping glass, tips a wick into it flame, snatching the breath from the inside, then sets it on a practice arm of rolled linen so you can watch the skin draw up like dough under a rising sun. Fire cupping, he says, is useful for revulsion, tugging excess from one neighbourhood to another, like persuading gossip to move down the street. A man in the corner groans around a tooth that's trying to escape. The barber gestures him over, between bleeds, packs your elbow with a folded cloth, then cradles the jaw with tenderness that nearly hurts to see. A twist, a bright sound like a fork dropped in a sink, and the tooth comes out with a tiny flag of gums attached. He'll rinse it in wine and hold it up to the light the way fishermen pose with an especially argumentative trout. Mainstream fact number 2. No garnish barber surgeons do dentistry because someone must and pliers are agnostic. You promise your molars extra floss if they keep the peace. Back to you, he peels the cloth and checks the basin right around the promised mark. He ties off a bandage with the effortless elegance of a sailor's bowline, then dabs the site with a little wad of wool soaked in vinegar. For fainter hearts, he keeps soporific sponges on a high shelf, wine opium and henbane, the lullaby you sniffed about in the infirmary, though he swears he rarely needs them for a simple vein. People nap on their own, he says, and you toy with a comeback but decide that sleep jokes write themselves when you are a quart lighter and emotionally transparent. He shows you for education and perhaps theatre a jar of leeches cruising their glass world like tiny commas. River physicians, he calls them with too straight a face. They prefer the jawline and the soft skin behind the ear, spots a little too intimate for your morning plans. The quirky tidbit comes wriggling some practitioners swear by sprinkling a pinch of breadcrumbs in the water to keep leeches frisky, while others insist a drop of beer makes them sociable. You're not qualified to adjudicate leech etiquette, but you are qualified to decline a tasting menu. The barber rehangs his lancets and wipes the phlegm with a cloth so clean it looks stern. He tells you quietly now that guilds keep standards that in some cities the line between barber and surgeon is policed with as much vigour as the line between baker and miller. The work may be lower status than the physician's scholastic prestige, but it is closer to the body, and the body answers honestly. You think about kitchen wisdom turned regimen, about cobwebs that knit and honey that warns off trouble, about the peppery soup that felt like hospitality wearing a lab coat. Maybe the town's health is a collage monk barber, midwife saint's bone, and that cat under the bed's clocking overtime, because he knows people bleed with their eyes as much as their veins. The barber offers you a sip of watered wine and a barley biscuit, the medieval juice box and cookie you didn't know you needed. He tells you to keep the bandage dry, to go easy on dancing, to avoid hot baths today, because heat pulls at sutures and common sense. He adds with a wink that if you must argue with anyone, do it seated. Light joke 3. Outside the pole tilts in a gust, turning slowly like a tiny lighthouse for ships of the vein. By the door he taps the basin's gradations again, the marks that pretended this was math, when it is also faith and fashion, and a very human need to pluck at fate's sleeve. You step out lighter in arm and oddly in mind, and the town's morning has sharpened around the edges. Bakery smoke, cart wheels, a dog performing quality assurance on yesterday's gutter choices. Your sleeve smells faintly of vinegar and lather. Somewhere behind you, a man leaves with one tooth fewer and a grin that says paradoxically relief. You tuck your arm close, promise your humours a calm afternoon, and head toward the river where the next therapy waits with a soft, cool mouth. You follow the street until it dissolves into fog curling off the river, where bathhouse roofs sweat little beads of dawn and the doors stand open like warm mouths exhaling rosemary. Inside, steam drifts in sheets, silvering the lamplight and softening every voice to a confidential purr. Birch brooms lean in a bucket, their green scent rising like a standing ovation for trees. You trade your cloak for a rough linen wrap, the medieval spa look, and take a seat on a plank bench, while an attendant swishes past with a glazed jar the size of a household onion. The jar is cloudy with movement leeches coiling and uncoiling like commas not yet placed. These are the river physicians the barber teased you with, clocking in for the morning shift. The attendant, broad-shouldered, calm, someone who has seen every expression the human face makes when it encounters the word leech, rests a cool palm under your jaw. For head congestion, she says, for swollen lids, for that ache you keep pretending is weather, and you're surprised by how specific this all feels. Mainstream fact, no mystery leeching as a standard therapy across Europe, revived from classical texts and practiced in hospitals and homes, with favoured species kept in jars of river water and applied to places where blood seems to stand. Behind the ears, along the jaw, at the temples, even for swollen joints, the logic is one part drainage, one part persuasion. You tilt your head and your pulse murmurs its consent. She rubs the skin lightly with a scrap of cloth dipped in wine. A drop glitters, a leech finds it the way a story finds an ear. You feel it test, then commit with a grip like 2 points kissing through a veil. The sensation surprises you, not pain so much as cool insistence, a straw in a stubborn drink. Another finds the soft notch behind your other ear, the place you've never named, and you become a little constellation of intention. The room's noise recedes until you can hear the soft syllables of water against tile. They know where to bite, the attendant says with a smile that suggests she's joking with the folklore leeches don't go to medical school, but also honouring the muscle memory of a craft. Light joke 1, if they did go to medical school, they'd specialise in psychology. A steward passes with a copper kettle topping tubs already infused with thyme and marjoram. and the steam writes herbal notes across your forehead, green resinous, a little wild. You ease into a tepid bath that hugs your shins and takes years off your knees. The attendant drapes warm cloths across your shoulders and keeps an eye on your tiny companions who work without a union break. Around you, people murmur in the generous way steam makes possible. Someone discusses a poultice of bread and milk for a chest cough. Someone else swears by rose water for feverish cheeks. The bathhouse is a clinic disguised as gossip, and you relax because care feels like community here, heat water, and the joint conspiracy to believe tomorrow will be kinder. On the wall hangs a board with painted diagrams where to place leeches for nosebleeds, call the rims of the nostrils gates for throat swelling along the jaw's curve for tender overfull veins, the swollen map laid out and labelled. A box of small wooden stoppers, leeches hate salt vinegar. Poke sits within reach in case an eager worker needs encouragement to clock out. The attendant tells you to keep still. The leeches will unlatch when they're done, smooth as a curtain falling. Historians still argue whether leeching actually improved conditions like venous congestion, or whether the calm, the heat, and the sense of being tended delivered the real medicine and the leech merely gave everyone a spectacle to credit. You so can think either way. The bathhouse has turned your worry into an errand, and that has value. She checks your pulse, not the fancy three-finger reading you've seen physicians perform, but a practical thumb on the river inside your wrist. She has a leech finder's story to fill the quiet out in the marshes. Collectors wade barefoot to lure the creatures onto their legs, then pluck them off into jars paid by the dozens and are proud of the scars that look like a map of stubborn ponds. That's your quirky tidbit brought to you by the gig economy of medieval wetlands. You imagine the job posting must enjoy long walks, minimal screaming, generous relationship with mud. Light joke 2. She laughs and admits that in truth the best collectors know the season and the corners where the water idles the language of reeds. Steam softens the world until even the copper basins look friendly. A boy brings in fresh bundles of herbs and the bathmaster robes hitched sandals. Slapping checks the fuel for the heater, a small dragon of a furnace tucked in a back room. He calls the place a stew, the English nickname for bathhouses, and you decide not to pursue the culinary metaphor while you are the one being simmered. Mainstream fact takes the foreground again. Public and private baths, sometimes attached to hospitals and monasteries, sometimes run as commercial houses dot medieval towns, part hygiene, part therapy, part social calendar. Whether people bathe daily, weekly, or mostly by rumour depends on wealth, climate and taste, but the infrastructure exists, and on nights like this it hums. One of your leeches has finished. You feel a loosening, a farewell handshake, and then the tiniest slide as it lets go, satiated and suddenly uninterested in your opinion. A trickle of fluid freckles your neck. The attendant presses a pad of lint and a dab of vinegar, the same friendly sting the barber used on your elbow. The other lingers a professional who refuses to rush a job. You watch its body, now plumper, now slowing an hourglass that measures nothing useful to anyone but itself. The attendant tips it back into the jar with a practiced flick, and you catch your reflection in the water-flushed, damp, strangely rested, as if your face decided to drop a complaint it had been rehearsing all winter. Because the bathhouse is also a pharmacy, you're offered a cup of posset-warm milk negated with wine and spiked with nutmeg, the medieval nightcap your grandmother would approve if she also approved of henbane sponges. She would not. The bathmaster runs through the house rules, nothing too hot after leeching. Keep the bites clean, no wrestling for the rest of the day unless it's metaphoric. He adds deadpan that if you must make life-changing decisions, do it seated, echoing the barber's advice with the authority of a man who has scraped several guests off the tiles. Light joke 3. You drape your wrap a little tighter and decide your life-changing decisions can wait until the stew stops steaming. A woman at the far tub pinches her nose, tilts back her head, and inhales steam from a cone of linen, head-cold choreography you recognise from every century. Another soaks her feet in a basin strewn with mustard seed to wake the blood in her toes. Someone whispers about a travelling doctor who sells a perfumed paste to smear inside the nostrils against corrupted air, and claims it's made from angelica and secrets. You file that under plague time perfumes, a callback you suspect will matter when the beaked masks appear. You remember the honey jar and cobweb roll in the infirmary, and admire again how many cures a simple kindness is given a little theatre. By the doorway hangs a bundle of birch twigs, and the attendant offers to switch the air around you with brisk strokes, not punishment but circulation. Your skin warms and the bites blush like well-behaved punctuation. She tells you to sleep on a slightly raised pillow tonight, so the fullness slips from your temples and to walk outside at dawn when the air is honest unless the wind tastes sick, in which case tuck Rue into your sleeve the way the monk showed you. The whole town, you realise, is an ecosystem of shared habits. Barber, monk, bathmaster, midwife, everyone tending the same weather inside different houses. The debate slips back through the steam historians still argue whether bathhouses extended health or invited disease, whether sharing tubs spread more than warmth, whether closures in later centuries had more to do with morality tales than microbes. You can't adjudicate from your small island of rosemary-scented mist. What you can do is notice that you breathe more easily, that your jaw has loosened its clenched little fist, that being cared for in a room full of water and voices has dissolved a knot you didn't know you were feeding. You stand dry dress, and the cold air in the changing room feels like a new coin in the palm. Outside, the river moves with a purpose that looks like calm from here. A leech jar rides past in the attendant's hands, tiny silhouettes stitching and unstitching along the glass. The striped pole is somewhere behind you now, in a street you can't quite see through the fog. Ahead, alleys braid toward a square where incense has learned to mean courage. You tuck the bathhouse warmth under your cloak the way a cat tucks paws under itself, compact, self-satisfied, ready to nap. And as you walk, you touch the tender spot behind your ear and think sometimes medicine is a story you let bite you just enough to believe. You turn a corner and the alley narrows to a throat of stone, the air suddenly crowded with smoke that smells like a herb garden learning to shout juniper, rosemary, bay, something bitter that feels like it's scrubbing your sinuses with a twig. People have wedged braziers in doorways and their little tongues of flame lick perfumed cones made of resin and ground herbs sweetening the wind as if the right incense could teach the air some manners. Out of that perfumed haze steps the shape the monk warned you about, a figure in a long waxed cloak, wide-brim hat, and that beak long curved, glass-eyed like a bird who got lost on its way to a masquerade. You finally believe your own earlier joke. It really does look like the doctor is auditioning for bird roles. The beak is not mere theatre, he tells you in a voice that lands somewhere between priest and chimney sweep. It's a filter. Inside are herbs and aromatics. Angelica myrrh, mint cloves, sometimes camphor or a sponge dampened with strong vinegar, stuffed in like a travelling potpourri. The theory mainstream for centuries is that bad air miasma carries illness on its breath, and that if you trap that air in a nose full of botanicals, you can strip the harm and keep the living. You can hear Galen whispering in the background. Bodies are where the cities are weather, and tonight the forecast is smoky with a chance of hope. The doctor taps the beak with a gloved knuckle. It's a portable herb garden strapped to a face. Like joke one, he carries a staff not as a fashion statement but as a boundary marker, the medieval social distancing wand that says kindly, "Stay there, I'll prod from here." He gestures with it toward the braziers and nods approval. Fumigation is the order of the hour. Houses burn juniper to scour rooms, strew floors with rue, and pennyroyal hang posies in windows as if flowers could draft a treaty with the wind. You see Pomander's little perforated metal apples swinging on chains from belts and nosegays clenched in hands or tucked under chins as if the world were a banquet, and the only way to survive is to keep smelling it. Someone whispers about carrying vinegar-soaked sponges in the mouth. You resist an urge to ask whether that counts as an appetizer. He leads you through the crowd with the easy grace of someone who has learned how to be visible without being touched. Close up, the costume's details resolve the cloak stiff with wax or oil, the gloves, the boots, the glass lenses set into the mask so eyes can watch without weeping, the collar sealed high as if shame itself were contagious. Mainstream fact offered. Plainly the beaked playgood costume is a real protective outfit, but most historians place its theatrical beak in the 17th century, especially Italy and France, while earlier medieval healers more often relied on layers of cloth hoods and a lot of herbs at nose and door. Historians still argue whether the long-beaked mask ever truly stalked 14th century alleys, or whether our memory has stapled later bird faces onto earlier fear. A woman steps from a doorway with a bowl of fragrant paste and asks the doctor to bless it with opinion. He dips a gloved finger and sniffs. Vinegar of the Four Thieves, she says, wine vinegar steeped with garlic rosemary, sage cloves, sometimes lavender, allegedly the secret that let a band of thieves rob plague houses without falling to the sickness. Quirky tidbit, the legend will bob around Europe for centuries, recipe morphing like a folktale, marketed later as a household disinfectant with the kind of branding any modern influencer would admire. Whether it is miracle or marinade is beyond tonight's pay grade. You take a careful whiff and decide it smells like a medieval artisanal candle called Saving Throw. Light joke 2. At the end of the lane, a parish clerk dusts door lintels with chalk crosses, while a boy trails him with a censer. The smoke coils into rooms where people sit with windows cracked. Not too wide, the air outside is under indictment, but wide enough to let prayers make small exits. The doctor pauses to instruct a household keep. Coals steady, sprinkle herbs, rinse hands and face with rose vinegar. Keep your belly sensible, no banquets while the air is moody, and sleep off the edge, so breath has room to travel. He recites the 6 non-naturals like a liturgy you've now heard twice. Air, diet, movement, rest, evacuation, passions, and you hear how easily wellness routine can become crisis plan when the wind is suspect. Down another alley, a seller lifts a tray of charms, and prayer slips the edges, browned by 2 near braziers. You recognise a wedge of parchment with the old abracadabra triangle meant to evaporate fevers letter by letter, and a tiny packet of dried angelica root to chew at dawn. The doctor doesn't sneer. He knows morale is medicine, that people need choreography when the invisible prowls the stairwell. He pockets a small charm himself, the sort of hypocrisy that looks a lot like kindness and moves on. You file that detail for the day when saints and relics get their closer look, and remember to bring your skepticism and your gentleness in equal amounts. A bell rings at the square, low and patient. Processions wind past, carrying banners, litanies braided with incense smoke. Some cities forbid them for fear that gathering breath to song will trade illness like gossip. Others cannot imagine a world where voices don't rise together when breath is the very thing at stake. The doctor watches unreadable behind glass, then turns into a lane where a woman is shuttering her shop. He checks her pulse, looks at her eyes, asks about stools and sleep, all the ordinary questions that keep fishing lines in the present. He prescribes a syrup of violet and honey comfort with credentials and a sachet of dried rosemary pinned to her sleeve. You remember the monk threading rue into your cuff and feel the small continuity of green things trying to be brave. A boy darts up with a clove-studded apple, a pomander more cookbook than apothecary, and the doctor buys it, hangs it from his staff like a festive sign for invisible customers. He tells you behind the glass that smell is reassurance. You can wear a way of policing the border between your body and a world that feels suddenly too communal. People smell their posies because the nose is a gate, and tonight you guard the gate with cloves. He adds practical as the barber's basin that perfumed masks also trap moisture from breath. The beak is a humidifier with delusions of grandeur. Light joke 3. The original smart mask, no battery required. You stand in a doorway while the doctor and a lamplighter confer about corners of the town that need more smoke, stairwells, hallways, those dressing rooms where air forgets to move. They talk fuel juniper, if you can spare it rosemary, if you can't bay leaves, if the cook will stop glaring, and whether the wind tonight is honest or lying. You like the vocabulary, it makes the weather a character you can bargain with. He warns against charcoal braziers in sealed rooms. Air needs to be cleansed, not used up. You nod the modern part of your brain, the one that knows numbers and oxygen and bad headlines, appreciating a moment where advice crosses centuries intact. At a fountain, you watch an assistant wash hands in vinegar, then rinse with water perfumed by a string bag of herbs dunked like tea. A basket waits with fresh linen masks, plain cloth squares to tie over the face, the pre-beak standard that still does honest work. The assistant passes one to you for the sake of theatre and maybe health, and you tie it on, surprised by your own relief at the faint sting of the vinegar. The doctor notices and gives a small nod, the closest a beaked face can come to a smile. He guides you at last to the edge of the market, where a booth sells uroscopy flasks and painted urine and wheels, and you feel the story turning steam to smoke, smoke to glass, smell to colour. The doctor taps the beak again, as if to say this is one way to read the air, and next you will read the body's small lanterns. As you step away, the braziers crackle. The smoke lifts and the alley opens like a held breath released. People keep moving, sweeping thresholds, tying charms, ladling soup that tastes like courage with onions. You tuck the scent of clothes behind your ear where the leech kissed you earlier, and think medicine is sometimes a smell, sometimes a story, and sometimes, just sometimes, a long nose full of herbs trying to sweeten a hard night. The market stall with the glass flasks turns into a doorway, and the doorway becomes a study that glows like liquid amber. Shelves of pear-shaped vessels catch the light so that everywhere you look you see small suns rising in someone else's morning. The physician, no beak, just a dark robe, and the calm of a person who trusts glass motions you closer. He picks up a matula, the standard flask, narrow neck-round belly, and holds it against a scrap of white linen to read the colour. You recognise the choreography swirl lift compare conclude. Mainstream fact steady as the shelf beneath your fingers, uroscopy is the diagnostic poster child of medieval medicine, so iconic that the medulla becomes the physician's emblem, on town signs, manuscript margins, and the gold-embossed fantasies of apothecaries. If you want to be seen as a doctor in these centuries, you hold a little bottle of yesterday's truth. He points to a painted wheel on the table, a urine chart arranged in a crown of colours from pale straw to deep saffron to alarming brown, and if life insists a black that nobody invites to dinner. Around the circle, neat captions: cold and moist, hot and dry, choleric, phlegmatic, sanguine, melancholic. Beside the wheel sits a parchment that diagrams the flask like a landscape top for vapour middle, for body bottom, for sediment, with a tiny flag at each level labelled foam, cloud, gravel, thread, and the ever-troublesome nubecula, the little cloud that suggests all is not well. The physician sets the flask near a candle, and the light pushes through like sunrise through fog. "Morning sample," he murmurs. "Best behaved." You nod like someone who's been on good terms with coffee for years. He swirls and watches how the liquid clings, then taps the belly with a fingernail to coax a fizz into confessing. He inhales not too close and lets the scent tell him about heat and damp, about whether your body's kitchen has been overseasoned. He flicks the wheel with a finger, and it spins gently, a medieval colour picker for the weather inside you. You can't help thinking it's the original health app, only this one works without batteries and politely refuses to track your steps. Light joke 1. Because you've learned the town's medicine in chapters, you appreciate how this scene threads into the earlier ones. Humours painted as colours, diet as weather bleeding, as scheduled housekeeping, leeches as punctuation. Here the body delivers a postcard with notes in amber ink. He reads for illness, yes, but also for rhythm. Whether the fever's critical day is nearing, whether the liver is sulking, whether the kidneys are throwing gravel the size of bad arguments. He tilts the flask and points to a sandy sparkle you'd rather not discuss. "Stones," he says kindly. "Warm water rest a decoction of couch grass and marshmallow." You try not to imagine marshmallow as anything but confectionery. Medieval you is learning to share vocabulary. On a lower shelf sits a travelling case fitted like a jewellery box with indentations for flasks, because sometimes patients send their urines by courier when they can't leave home. The physician grins, confiding that market days bring a parade of bottle bearers with someone's morning tucked under cork. Quirky tidbit pamphleteers, mock piss prophets, those bold souls who claim to predict not just disease, but personality and prognosis from a glance at a jar. Some boast they can tell pregnancy and even the baby's sex without ever meeting the mother. He rolls his eyes, but not unkindly. Satire finds its target because the practice is common enough to lampoon. There's even that old seed test barley, and wheat sprouting faster in the urine of a pregnant woman that wanders in from antiquity. To hang around the edges of belief like an unreliable friend, he sets a different flask down, and with a formality that makes you hold your breath, dips, a fingertip touches it to his tongue, then immediately reaches for a cloth soaked in wine. Rarely, he says, almost apologetic, but sometimes necessary. He's checking for suspicious sweetness, the kind that means the body is letting sugar pass through like a guest who never pays for dinner. You wince on his behalf. The room smells of resin and candle, and a faint warm tang that reminds you this is intimate work performed with etiquette and a steady stomach. Historians still argue whether physicians routinely tasted urine, or whether satirists magnified an occasional test into a running joke. They also argue whether medieval doctors truly recognised a coherent sweet urine syndrome, or simply noticed a pattern without a shared name diagnosis. What you see is a man who treats information like a scarce spice used sparingly, with respect and followed by a rinse. Because he's a teacher at heart, he lays out a small theatre of sediments on a strip of black cloth fine powder that points to gravel feathery threads that speak of the kidneys, muttering, "A thick cloud that fits fevers the way fog fits the river." He explains that young people's urines run lighter, elders darker, that summer heats and winter calms, that violent motion stirs the bottom so even healthy water looks like it has opinions. He insists gently but firmly that uroscopy is a guide, not a gavel, and that any physician who diagnoses from a flask alone deserves a lecture from his own conscience. You think of the barber's basin with its measuring lines pretending to be mathematics, and you admire the honesty of a craft that admits its own theatrics. On the desk, among quills that look like disciplined birds, lies a rhymed Latin text, Giles of Corbeil's verses on urine, because even diagnostics get set to music in a world where memory loves a beat. He recites a couplet, and the words hop like pebbles skipping across a pond. You learn the polite vocabulary for things you'd usually discuss only with plumbers. How foam persists can hint at heat. How a sandy fall predicts the kind of day you'd like to trade. How pale, plentiful water might say the body is spending more than it earns. He makes notes in a clean looping hand and folds the parchment like a secret. A woman arrives with a basket and a curtsy, places her flask on the cloth and waits. The physician checks colour, body, sediment, warmth. He asks about chills, appetite, sleep, the kind of ordinary inventory that makes health less mysterious and more like housekeeping. He prescribes a barley water with a ribbon of honey. Hello again, golden jar and a little fennel, then warns against the great oven's overheated rooms that bake fevers into something stubborn. He doesn't forget morale. He hands her a sprig of borage for courage, because even if plants can't fix everything, a patient who smiles heals better than one who gnaws the inside of her worry all night. At your elbow sits a narrow wand of silver ending in a tiny spoon. He admits some doctors heat such a spoon and dip it to raise a scent for diagnosis, a technique you decide not to audition at home or ever. Another tool looks like a glass thimble used to isolate and inspect bubbles that cling. And speak of heat. This is science by metaphor. You think clouds, threads, sands, skies, weather in a bottle read by a man who keeps both feet on the ground. Yet caution walks the room like a second physician. Historians still argue whether the focus on urine sometimes encouraged a lazy practice diagnosis at the door from a servant's delivery versus the more careful tradition that folded uroscopy into a full exam with hand on pulse and eye on skin. The physician here makes his case by example. He puts the flask down, asks the patient to breathe, looks at the whites of her eyes, feels the wrist, and only then writes. The medulla becomes a window, not a mirror that traps the whole truth. He sends you off with a curious souvenir, a tiny painted urine wheel on a scrap of parchment, a pocket sunset you'll never use but will keep because it rescues fear into colour. As you step back into the alley, the day tilts toward afternoon, and the beaked doctor from earlier crosses the square, his staff pomander swinging like a clock. The barber's pole still turns where the street bends, the bathhouse steam thins into memory, the infirmary's cat is probably warming a fresh stone by now. You tuck the parchment beside the sprig of rue and the smell of cloves and think in this town even your worries get bottled red, and if you're lucky, diluted with a little barley, a little borage, and the promise that someone somewhere is watching the weather on your behalf. The alley opens into a courtyard where the air feels oddly taller, as if the buildings themselves have tilted their chins to see the sky. You follow a flight of creaking stairs to a study that smells of lamp oil and scraped parchment. On the wall hangs a woodcut of the zodiac man Homo Signorum, in which Aries clutches the head, Taurus owns the throat, Gemini, the arms, and so on down the body to Pisces flicking its tail at the feet. The astrologer-physician robe, ink-stained hands, steady eyes that hoard starlight gestures you to a low stool and sets an astrolabe on the table with the care other people reserve for sleeping cats. We've looked inward, he says, nodding toward your pocket urine wheel. Now we look upward, so we can time your remedies to the world that made you. Mainstream fact, plain as the steel pointer. He slides across the star map in much of medieval Europe. Medicine and astrology travel as a pair. Universities teach both almanacs, print tables for the sky, and physicians consult ephemerides the way a sailor reads tides. The logic is cosmological and practical at once. If the body is a weather, then the heavens are the pressure systems that make your bones ache before rain. He spreads an almanac across the desk, the pages stiff and speckled with numbers like a spilled beehive. Columns declare where the moon wanders, which sign it inhabits, what day favours purging, what hour makes bloodletting less argumentative. To you it looks like the original calendar app, only this one never needs charging and never pushes ads for scented candles. Light joke 1, he draws your decumbiture, the chart cast for the hour you first took to bed with your complaint and origin point for your illness in the heavens. He marks the ascendant checks which planets lord over, that degree glances at where Mars and Saturn sulk malefic by reputation, and whether Venus and Jupiter benefic and expansive lend a soft hand. Then he measures the moon's speed swift or sluggish, and whether it is applying to a pleasant aspect or picking a fight. He does not look worried. He looks like a man assembling weather reports into a forecast you can actually use for deciding whether to carry an umbrella or a leech jar. You confess that your barber already opened a vein and your bathhouse attendant let 2 river physicians write punctuation behind your ears. He smiles leafs to a diagram that pairs the zodiac man with a calendar of good and bad signs for bloodletting and points with a nail as neat as a quill tip. Do not bleed the head while the moon is in Aries, he says, tapping the ram at the skull, nor the throat in Taurus, nor the arms in Gemini. The rule wanders everywhere in handbooks: avoid letting from the region governed by the sign the moon currently inhabits. Otherwise you anger the neighbourhood watch. He shows the planetary hours table, those unequal 12s that carve day and night, and circles the hours ruled by Mars for cautery and surgery, Jupiter for strengthening, Venus for soothing. You think of the monk's 6 non-naturals and admire how many levers medieval people tried to keep within reach. He threads a paper wheel of Vauvel through its pin and turns the rings so the moon's sign, the weekday and the hour align. Quirky tidbit, and it spins right in front of you. These little cardboard computers live in almanacs and physicians' notebooks, allowing you to time a purge, choose a vein, or scowl at Mars with more accuracy and fewer migraines. Some are so pretty you suspect half their virtue is morale. A chart that looks like a jeweled compass can make even an enema feel navigational. Light joke 2. Because you've learned to listen for debates woven through the routine, you hear him say, almost offhand, that historians still argue whether practitioners truly believed the stars caused disease or whether astrological timing functioned as a shared scheduling language, a way to coordinate care, reassure anxious patients, and avoid after-the-fact blame. He shrugs in a way that suggests the argument lives in his own head too. Belief and habit aren't always cleanly separable. Sometimes you keep the ritual because the community does, and because it helps you hold still long enough for the body to do what it knows. He points again at the Zodiac Man, then at your arm, where the bandage from the barber's bench peaks like a white flag. If we must bleed again, he says, we'll wait until the moon leaves Aries and wanders into a sign of the lower body, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. The sky will be thinking about knees and feet then. Your head can be left out of the gossip. He grins, and you do too, because you've started speaking horoscope like a dialect learned from kind neighbours. He adds that strong purges go ill when the moon is void, of course, between conversations with other planets, because actions begun without witness often go nowhere good. You file that under kitchen wisdom with constellations. He lays a hand on a phase diagram waxing moon, for building waning, for reducing. A fever that surges with waxing light wants cooling and rest. A weak appetite may take strengthening foods as the moon fattens. You remember the diet rules in the infirmary: hot, cold, wet, dry, and feel the click as the sky snaps onto the plate barley and lettuce when you must bring down heat. Capon and spice when the coldness lingers like a guest who won't take a hint. The alignment is more poetry than physics, but you're not allergic to poetry, especially when it keeps you in bed under a warm stone with permission to nap. Because the body has long memories, he asks which day your fever first sank its claws. You count backward and land embarrassingly on a feast day where you overreach the ale. He circles the 7th day after onset, then the 9th and 11th, those ancient critical days inherited from Hippocratic medicine, when a fever is supposed to turn crisis, or lysis the coin toss. He will watch your pulse and urine around those dates. If the tide breaks, he'll ease up. If it surges, he'll bleed or purge in the hour and sign that argue least. Mainstream fact again, steady as lamplight, the doctrine of critical days persists through medieval practice, stitched to lunar cycles in all those calendars pinned to apothecary walls. He opens a small cupboard and reveals what looks like a starry spice rack electuary jars labelled with planets: jovial for easing martial, for stirring Venusian, for soft hearts, saturnine for stubborn blockages. Half therapy, half branding, all theatre. You smile because the honey jar from the infirmary glows in memory, and you suspect honey would volunteer for any planet's team as long as it gets to soothe. He laughs and admits that sometimes the most celestial thing in the room is a good bedside manner. A young man arrives cradling his wrist, a sprain earned by trying to carry 2 baskets of eels because masculinity. The astrologer glances at the sky through the casement clouds, thin early evening's first star hiding a yawn, and consults the almanac. He binds the wrist sets, a cooling poultice, and schedules a brief cupping tomorrow in a Jupiter hour, when swelling has a habit of minding its manners. He jots a caution to avoid heavy lifting, until the moon leaves Taurus, which sits on the throat but has a reputation for stubbornness that no tendon needs to borrow. The patient nods solemnly, as if he has just promised not to arm wrestle the Zodiac. Because no visit ends without a piece of portable advice, you learn the hair and nail. Folklore, the city gossips swear by cut hair as the moon waxes if you want it to grow fast trim during the waning. If you prefer low-maintenance humility, do not shave the nape when the moon lingers in Leo, unless you enjoy drama. He offers it with a grin, labelling it civic astrology customs that keep barbers' chairs full and people feeling aligned with something bigger than their cowlicks. Light Joke 3. The room darkens the astrolabe's brass, catching a last spoonful of light. He writes you a regimen that doesn't feel like superstition so much as choreography. Short walks at dawn when the air is honest. A cooling pottage tonight, endive barley, a touch of dill. Avoid large decisions when you haven't slept. Keep the bandage dry, and if you must bleed again, return when the moon has moved on from the head's real estate. The heavens are a clock, he says, but we don't worship clocks, we use them. As you step back into the courtyard, a bell counts the hour, and a sliver of moon sails above rooflines like a clipped fingernail. Somewhere down the lane, your beaked acquaintance tilts a pomander. Somewhere behind you, the bathhouse sighs. Somewhere further yet, the infirmary's cat approves of planetary hours because they correspond to prime napping windows. Historians still argue whether timing truly shifted outcomes or simply gave frightened bodies a schedule they could lean on. You tuck the paper Vorvel beside your sprig of rue and your urine wheel and decide that for tonight you'll let the moon keep the time while you keep the blankets. You duck under an archway into a cloister garden where the air smells of crushed green and the stone paths are quilted with moss. Monks in brown and grey drift among the beds, snipping, muttering and tucking leaves into baskets with the tenderness of people handling small birds. This is the physic garden, the monastery's living apothecary, where the saints of medicine wear roots instead of halos. A cloaked figure, your infirmary guide from that first night, greets you with a sprig of mint and the grin of someone about to introduce you to old friends. We've looked at blood stars and bottles, he says. Now we meet the leaves. Mainstream fact monastic gardens like this, which are common across medieval Europe, laid out in neat beds for ease of tending and memory growing the materia medica recorded in herbals, those thick illustrated books that blend observation lore and occasionally the kind of imagination that gives mandrake roots human legs. He leads you past rosemary for remembrance rue against foul air's sage. Why should a man die while sage grows in his garden, and meadowsweet to sweeten rooms and bellies? Each plant comes with a story, and sometimes the story is the reason the plant stays. You pause at a bed of mandrake low leaves splaying like a green starfish. The monk's voice drops that storytelling register that pulls children and strangers closer. Quirky tidbit, the root when pulled is said to scream, and its cry can kill or drive mad. To harvest it safely, legend says, you tie a dog to the plant, back away, and tempt the dog forward so it tugs the root free and dies in your place. He lifts an eyebrow. Historians still argue whether anyone ever tried this, or whether the story's power lay entirely in warning away casual thieves. Either way, the mandrake enjoys a reputation as a sedative and fertility aid steeped in wine, or worn as a charm, its humanoid shape feeding the sense that it knows secrets about your own bones. Light joke 1. No, we don't name them. That would be weird. He leads you to a patch of foxglove tall spires with throats of freckled purple. The monks know it as digitalis, useful for dropsy swelling from heart trouble, but dangerous in excess. He pinches a leaf, sniffs, and warns that healing and harming are often neighbours in the same plant. The art is knowing when the gate is open. Beyond it grows borage, starry blue flowers that cheer the heart steeped in wine for the courage before battle or childbirth. You think of the woman leaving the physician's shop with a sprig of borage tucked into her sleeve, and the loop closes neatly in your mind. In the shade of the cloister wall hangs a series of illustrated herbals pages pegged to dry. One shows fennel its text claiming it clears the eyes and aids digestion. Another displays horehound useful for coughs. The drawings are not perfectly botanical, they wear the proportions of memory and the colours of ink that ages to gold brown. The monk confesses they copy from older texts, Dioscorides, Pliny, and from the physic gardens of sister houses. Each scribe adds his own flourish. A few plants get dragon-like roots or flowers arranged in heraldic poses. You smile because even the scientific pages can't resist a bit of theatre. You kneel by a bed of valerian, its white umbels shaking in the breeze. He explains it as a sleep aid, a calmer of agitated hearts, but also a lure for cats who roll in it, as if the world has finally agreed with them. Light joke 2. We grow this in the back, otherwise the infirmary cat would unionize. He gestures to comfrey, the bone-knit plant mashed into poultices for sprains and fractures. He pulls a jar from a shelf in the arcade, a comfrey root decoction, thick, earthy, smelling faintly like wet bread. You imagine it wrapped around a shinbone warmth seeping into the marrow's mood. Historians still argue how much of monastic herb lore was empirical tested and passed down because it worked, and how much leaned on classical authority or pure tradition. The monk shrugs. For him, the garden is part pharmacy, part prayer. If rosemary reminds you of home, it heals twice, he says, once in the body, once in the mind. You think of the astrologer's note about passions of the soul and how morale seems to haunt every doorway in this town like a friendly ghost. At a low bench, another brother grinds dried chamomile flowers with honey into a paste for poultices. He offers you a dab on the back of your hand. The scent is apple sweet and calming. He talks of yarrow to staunch bleeding plantain for wounds, betony for all maladies of the head. You notice a bundle of betony hanging over the infirmary door when you glance back in memory. Nothing here stands alone. Every remedy is part of a web of practice tied to diet timing and often a prayer. The monk brings you to a vine of hops trained along a trellis. You think of beer, he thinks of sleep and easing digestion. In the infirmary, they might tuck dried hop flowers into a patient's pillow. He plucks one, rubs it between his fingers, and lets the scent rise like a sigh. Nearby, an elder tree leans over the wall, its blossoms dried for teas against colds, its berries cooked into syrups. He warns that the raw parts can be toxic. The elder, like foxglove, demands manners. In a sunny corner, a novice waters dill anise and coriander. These seeds travel easily. Traders bring them from ports far away and they plant themselves in both kitchen and physic garden. The monk admits quietly that some herbs here are less for medicine and more for making the infirmary food taste less like penance. Light joke 3. Healing is faster when the soup doesn't hold a grudge. You remember the peppery broth from your first night and suspect a conspiracy of flavour at work. A wooden chest by the wall holds dried herbs in cloth bags labelled in Latin and vernacular. Some are for decoctions boiled to pull out strength, others for infusions, some to burn for fumigation. A few, like wormwood, serve both as tonic and as moth deterrent for stored cloth. He lifts a bag of lavender, the scent immediate and clean, and says they use it for linens and as a gentle sedative. You pocket a sprig when he isn't looking, adding to your growing collection of scents and charms. Historians still argue how widely such gardens' knowledge spread beyond cloister walls. Some say monasteries guarded recipes as closely as relics. Others point to herbals copied and circulated, and to lay healers, often women who matched the monks leaf for leaf in some skill. The monk seems unconcerned. Plants will grow for anyone who gives them soil and a little company. He believes in sharing, and his pockets often come up mysteriously lighter after visits from travellers. As the sun leans west, you follow him to the gate, past beds now humming with bees, and the late-day chorus of crickets. You carry the scent of mint on your fingers and the feel of chamomile's softness under your thumb. Outside, the street smells suddenly sharper, less forgiving, but you have leaves in your pouch and a mental map of where rosemary stands guard, where comfrey waits, where the mandrake tells its improbable tales. Somewhere a beaked doctor passes with his pomander. Somewhere the astrologer turns a wheel. Somewhere the barber polishes a basin. You walk with a garden's worth of quiet in your sleeves and the suspicion that the next remedy will smell like wine and wild flowers steeped into sleep. You leave the garden's green hush and follow the monk through a covered passage into a room that smells of smoke herbs and a sweetness that's just on the edge of suspicious. A table holds a cluster of earthenware jugs and a pile of dark porous sponges the size of small fists. They look innocent, but the monk grins like someone who knows their party trick. Soporific sponges, he says, lifting one to your nose. The scent hits like a crowded apothecary wine-soaked bitter with henbane whispering of opium, laced with hemlock and black nightshade. For surgery he adds to turn shrieks into snores. Mainstream fact recipes for anaesthetic sponges appear in medieval medical texts from the Arab world and Europe wine as solvent potent herbs as the knockout chorus, the whole soaked, dried, and later re-wet to release its fumes. The patient inhales, drowses, and ideally sleeps through the knife's visit. Historians still argue whether these mixtures genuinely knocked people out or simply dulled the edge enough to hold still with a few dangerously deep naps thrown in. Either way, the idea was elegant. Put the body somewhere else while the work got done. The monk squeezes one over a bowl and the dark drops steam faintly in the cool air. He explains how the sponge is pressed to the patient's face while assistants hold limbs and prayer beads alike. The surgeon works fast, setting bones, cutting out bladder stones, sewing wounds. Quirky tidbits, some texts warn to keep vinegar on hand as to rouse the sleeper, wipe the face wave under the nose and hope the soul decides to return. You can almost hear a medieval surgeon's version of "Stay with me, light" joke 1, the medieval equivalent of a snooze button. On a shelf sit other tools for quieting pain, a cup of warm wine for courage, a paste of poppy seeds for the gums and a strip of willow bark for chewing the tree, lending its bitterness as a primitive aspirin. There's even a little carved whistle blown hard enough it distracts the patient, or maybe just the surgeon, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. He invites you to watch as an assistant sharpens a long, thin knife on a whetstone, the sound rasping like dry reeds. This will be for lancing abscesses, or performing la petite chirurgie, the small surgical acts that still make a big impression on the person underneath. The patient drowsed by sponge or wine might be further soothed by a psalm murmured in one ear and the steady hand of someone who has cut this same path many times before. In the corner, a brazier warms a set of cautery irons, flat round star-shaped each end glowing like a sunset nailed to metal. They are used not only to stop bleeding, but in some theories to draw out sickness or balance the humours by relocating heat. You watch the monk place one back in the fire, the red tip breathing like an ember. He admits with a half smile that some patients preferred the soporific sponge before meeting these particular instruments. A small chest holds sachets of dried herbs mandrake, for sleep henbane, for stupor lettuce seeds, for calming all with precise measures, because too much turns healing into homicide. He shows you an illustration from an herbal. A sponge dangling from a stick so it can be pressed without leaning too close. Some texts recommend wrapping the head in a cloth to trap the vapours, a claustrophobic image you tuck away and decide not to dwell on before bed. Light joke 2 arrives as he recalls a patient who pretended to stay asleep long after surgery to avoid helping clean the floor. We let him lie, he says, but put a broom in his hand while he snored. You suspect this was both punishment and proof of recovery. Because some procedures couldn't wait for herbal experiments, the monk explains that surgeons often use brute efficiency, 2 assistants to hold the patient down, 1 to distract with drink or prayer, and the surgeon to act like time was a muscle he could cut. The soporific sponge was a luxury of planning. Emergencies rarely offer polite notice. He leads you to a bench where an amputated limb, a training model, not a fresh horror, rests for demonstration. Linen tourniquets are tied above the site, the knife makes its cut, the cautery seals the wound. Without some form of sedation, this is fire and steel in their rawest duet. With a sponge, the hope is for quiet enough to work without the patient thrashing themselves into worse injury. Quirky tidbit 2-1 Italian surgeon's manual warns not to oversoak the sponge lest the fumes drip into the mouth, causing not just sleep but choking. Another suggests adding clove or cinnamon to make the scent more agreeable, as if you can gift wrap unconsciousness. Light joke 3. If you wake up smelling cinnamon buns, congratulations, you survived. Historians still argue whether the sponges were genuinely widespread or mostly a learned curiosity passed from text to text, but rarely brewed to full potency. Surviving recipes are tantalizing but inconsistent, and without modern dosing, the line between comfort and catastrophe was easy to cross. The monk admits that in his own house they keep the recipe locked and prefer wine herbs and sheer speed. On a side table you see a small mortar where poppy seeds and vinegar are mashed into a paste for topical numbing less dramatic than a sponge, but easier to trust. There's also a jug of rose water for washing wounds and a small box of powdered frankincense, not just for scent, but for its mild antiseptic qualities. You begin to notice how often fragrance and function share the same jar in this world. As you leave, he offers you a small cloth packet not of sponge but lavender buds. For sleep without surgery, he says, the scent is soft and clean, nothing like the dark brew in the sponges. Outside the cloister sounds quieter, as if the soporific's promise has seeped into the air. Somewhere a beaked doctor might be loading his mask with herbs, somewhere the barber might be sharpening his phlegm, somewhere in a garden bed the mandrake waits screaming only in stories. You tuck the lavender in with your sprig of rue, your parchment wheel, your volvel. The soporific sponge lingers in your thoughts, not just as a medieval attempt at anesthesia, but as a reminder that even here, even now, people understood that the mind could be persuaded to step aside, and that sometimes the best medicine was simply not being present for the worst of it. You step through a narrow door into a chamber, where the walls seem too interested in your skull. The air smells of wood shavings and clean metal, and in the centre of the room sits a bench with leather straps comforting only if you enjoy being mistaken for luggage. A man in a dark wool gown greets you with a nod that says, "You're going to be fine," while his tools on the table mutter, "We'll see about that." His prize instrument gleams in the lamplight, a hand-cranked trepan, its circular blade looking disarmingly like a pastry cutter. Mainstream fact trepanation. The deliberate drilling or scraping of a hole into the skull has been practiced since prehistory and survived into the Middle Ages as a treatment for head injuries, pressure from fractures, and sometimes for ailments like epilepsy or headache of unknown spirit. Surgeons used it to remove bone splinters after battle, to drain blood, or to let out bad humours thought to be trapped in the skull. It's medicine with a carpentry problem. The surgeon gestures to a wood model of a skull, pointing out the spots to avoid sutures where bone plates meet arteries that object to being interrupted. The thin temple bones that crack like pastry under too much enthusiasm. He explains how the patient's head is shaved, the site cleaned with wine and the skin cut back to expose bone. Here the narration pauses, so you can decide whether to faint now or later. Light Joke 1. We recommend after the procedure less mess that way. On a side table rests a bowl of soporific sponges, like the ones you just saw in the cloister, a jug of strong wine and a psalter. The sponge is for sleep, the wine for courage, and the psalter for anyone who'd rather distract themselves with eternity than focus on the next half hour. Assistants hold the patient's head steady. The surgeon fits the trepan over the marked spot and turns the handle, slowly cutting a groove until the bone's outer table yields. He explains that medieval trepans often had a central pin to steady them withdrawn once the first bite was made. Historians still argue how often trepanation was fatal versus successful. Skeletal evidence shows many healed holes, which means patients survived long enough for bone to knit. That's the optimistic takeaway, alongside the fact that medieval surgeons knew enough to stop before penetrating the dura, the brain's protective layer. You breathe through your teeth as he runs a finger around the edge of a trepanned disc of bone, lifting it neatly from the model skull like a cookie from a tray. Quirky tidbit: some surgeons kept the removed bone as a charm, ground it for medicine, or gave it to the patient as a talisman against further injury. Others placed it back after cleaning a medieval replace cover before striking moment. In some regions, powdered skull was believed to help with epilepsy if taken in small doses, which is either poetic recycling or the worst post-op snack ever. Light Joke 2, because trepanation could also be used for spiritual complaints, madness, possession, or visions. He tells you about cases where the operation was as much exorcism as surgery. Some believe the hole allowed evil spirits to flee, others thought it admitted divine light. He shrugs in the universal surgeon's gesture for eye, cut they interpret. The line between spiritual cure and physical fix was thinner than a trepan's blade. On a shelf are different trepans, some crown-shaped, others like conical saws, and a few that look more like small drills. Each has a story: battlefield use, noble patient, or an unlucky fall from a horse. He points to a narrow chisel called an elevator, used to lift bone fragments without drilling, and a rasp for smoothing edges, so the skin can close more kindly over its new skylight. Light Joke 3 arrives when he pats the straps on the bench. These aren't for restraint, they're hugs you can't get away from. You decline a demonstration, choosing instead to watch him oil the trepan's handle, the way a violinist might tune strings after a performance. The tool hums with readiness, a sound you're happy to leave in theory. Because infection lurked behind every cut, he talks about wine vinegar and honey as cleansers and the use of fine linen to dress the wound. He nods toward the barber's vinegar pads, the infirmary's honey jar, and the herbal salves you've met. Everything in this town loops back into itself like a well-tied suture. Recovery, if all went well, meant weeks of rest, careful diet and prayers, to a saint who understood head troubles, St. Denis perhaps, who famously carried his own. Historians still debate whether trepanation for non-traumatic reasons like headache or epilepsy was based on observed relief in trauma cases, or purely on humoral theory's desire to vent excess. The surgeon here, pragmatic to the core, says he drills only when pressure is killing more surely than the tool. You get the feeling he'd rather prescribe herbs bleeding or a good poultice first, but he's proud of the skill when it's needed. Before you go, he shows you a small wooden box lined with straw, inside of which lies a circle of human bone polished smooth, carved with a cross. A former patient, he says, kept for luck. Whether the luck belonged to the patient or the surgeon is left politely ambiguous. You don't ask if the patient is still available for comment. Outside, the air feels taller again, as if your skull had taken a deep breath on your behalf. You glance at the rooftops, relieved they remain above you, rather than inviting you to see them from the inside out. Somewhere the astrologer's volvel spins quietly. Somewhere the bathhouse steam unwinds into the river. Somewhere a mandrake root waits in its bed, whispering that some holes are better left unmade. You pull your cloak a little closer and resolve to keep your head down, literally, until the next remedy asks for something less architectural. You wander towards the town's older quarter, where the cobbles look polished by more knees than feet. The air shifts from the vinegar and herb tang of the market to something quieter. Beeswax candle smoke, a trace of incense that clings to the hair and won't leave until it's prayed out. Here the houses huddle close around small chapels, and you notice how many doorways have bits of ribbon, knotted cords, or tiny pewter badges pinned just above the lintel. A woman in a blue cloak presses a string of beads into your palm before you can ask why. For safe travel, she says, and against the swelling. You don't want to know what's swelling, so you thank her and keep moving. Mainstream fact medieval medicine often braided together physical treatment and spiritual or magical protection. Physicians and lay healers alike might prescribe a visit to a saint's shrine, the wearing of a relic, or the recitation of certain charms alongside herbs and diet. In times of plague or chronic illness, relics of saints, bits of bone cloth, or even dust from a holy site were believed to offer divine intercession, where earthly remedies stalled. You can scoff, but you're in a century where morale counts as a treatment plan, and touching a bone wrapped in gold has cured more dread than any broth. Your first stop is the parish church, where a silver reliquary shaped like an arm rests on the altar. Inside, you're told, lies the forearm of a saint who healed the sick. Pilgrims press their own arms to the casing, hoping for relief from joint pain or weakness. A priest in a short cape murmurs blessings as people pass his voice, a steady background hum that almost disguises the sound of coins clinking into a box at the side. Some carry away a scrap of cloth that's been touched to the reliquary secondary relics, portable blessings you can pin to a tunic or slip under a pillow. Quirky tidbits: certain shrines offered contact cures where a sufferer would sleep overnight in the church beside the relic, hoping for healing dreams or visions of the saint offering advice. The practice called incubation borrowed from older pagan traditions and persisted well into the Christian Middle Ages. You picture the night the stone floor hard, the candles guttering the air, full of sleeping bodies and whispered bargains. Light joke, one great for your soul, terrible for your back. Outside the church, a stall sells pilgrim badges lead, or pewter trinkets cast with the image of the saint worn on hats or cloaks to advertise your journey, and by extension your protected status. The seller assures you the badges also remind the body to be well, which sounds like the kind of vague positivity your barber might approve. Some are shaped like tiny ampullae, meant to hold holy water or oil from the shrine. Others depict the saint mid-miracle. You pick one with a simple cross and pin it near your sprig of rue, wondering if they'll get along. The woman from earlier reappears this time, holding a folded parchment charm. Inside are Latin words, astrological signs, and a crude drawing of a human figure with the crosses on the head, heart, and belly. She explains this is to be worn close to the skin, ideally sewn into a pouch or amulet case. It's specific to fevers, she says, and must be blessed on a Thursday before sunrise for maximum effect. Historians still argue whether such charms were officially tolerated or quietly overlooked by church authorities. Some clergy condemned them as superstition, others wrote their own, filling the gap between faith and fear. A bearded man hawks St. John's girdles, long strips of parchment or cloth inscribed with prayers, meant to be worn wrapped around the body for protection. Pregnant women favoured them, tying the girdle snug until childbirth. The design sometimes included images of the Virgin or Christ alongside charms against evil wind and false labour. You can see how a symbolic embrace from a saint might ease a mind and by extension a body under strain. Light joke 2, like a medieval maternity belt, only with better calligraphy. In another stall, a young apprentice sells Agnus Dei, small discs of wax, stamped with a lamb, blessed at Easter, carried in purses hung by beds to ward off plague. The wax smells faintly of honey and incense, a scent that makes you feel more defended than logic will admit. You remember the pomanders and posies from the plague doctor's round, and realise that half this town's medicine chest could be described as things you can carry. Healers, too, sometimes prescribed the recitation of certain psalms or the Lord's Prayer, a set number of times interleaved with herbal doses, as though aligning the spirit and body's rhythms could tilt fate in your favour. In your head you hear the monk in the infirmary murmuring over a bowl of broth, and the rhythm feels the same, measured, deliberate, more about presence than speed. Quirky tidbit 2. Some charms instructed the wearer to avoid certain foods or actions while carrying them. No beans on Tuesdays, no stepping over thresholds with the left foot first restrictions, and that turned the charm into a miniature lifestyle plan. You can imagine someone crediting the amulet for recovery, when in truth it was the avoidance of spoiled beans doing the heavy lifting. Light joke 3. The charm works best if you don't poison yourself in other ways. Historians still argue whether relics and charms were more about psychological comfort than physical cure, but even the skeptics admit that hope can be an active ingredient. The line between morale and medicine blurs when a patient eats better, sleeps better, and accepts care, because they believe the saint is watching over them. In a world where many illnesses outpace the available treatments, keeping a patient from giving up could be half the work. You're led to a small chapel where a glass-fronted case holds a saint's skull crowned with a filigree halo. A young boy presses his forehead to the glass, his lips moving with a private petition. The priest nearby offers you a phial of water blessed by touching the skull. You take it, feeling the cool through the thin glass, and tuck it into your pouch beside the lavender from the soporific room. The pouch is starting to sound like a reliquary in its own right. As the evening bells sound, you leave the quarter with its mingled smells of incense and street stew. Your badge glints in the last light, your charm presses warm against your ribs, and the sprig of rue rustles softly with your steps. Somewhere the barber's pole keeps turning, somewhere the astrologer marks the moon's sign, somewhere the infirmary cat dozes without a single relic to its name. You breathe in the fading incense and think leaf, like a well-tended herb, can't cure everything, but it can change the flavour of the air you breathe while you wait for the body to decide its next move. You follow the road toward the edge of town where the smell of hearth smoke softens into something warmer. Bread, boiled milk, and the faint metallic tang of copper kettles. The houses here have wide doorways and open shutters, the better, to let air and visitors pass in and out without much ceremony. A woman in a dark wool gown waves you toward a low-beamed house with a painted sign of a swaddled infant. Inside, the air is heavy with heat, and the gentle murmur of voices a midwife's domain. Mainstream fact in medieval Europe, childbirth was the territory of women, midwives, female relatives and neighbours supported by Tool's herbal knowledge and a tangle of charms and prayers. Male physicians rarely entered these rooms unless the birth turned surgical. Here, skill is measured in how quickly hands can shift from soothing to decisive. The midwife greets you with flower on her sleeves and a birthing girdle folded neatly on a stool. She explains that women sometimes wore these long strips of parchment or cloth, covered with prayers, invocations of saints and protective symbols wrapped around the waist during pregnancy and especially during labour. Some girdles are stored in churches, borrowed like precious books and returned after use. Others are passed through families, softening with each generation's touch. She smooths the cloth as if it were a child's hair. Nearby, a pot steams gently on the hearth, cinnamon borage, and ruin wine meant to strengthen the mother's heart and encourage the child's feet to find the way. The midwife chuckles at her own metaphor and tells you that certain herbs like pennyroyal could be coaxed into starting labour, while others like raspberry leaf were given to tone and steady the womb. She moves easily between folklore and anatomy, naming bones and ligaments one moment, saints and star signs the next. Quirky tidbit: in some towns, a woman in labour might be given the church's relic of a saint associated with childbirth to hold, sometimes even St. Margaret's girdle, famous for easing difficult deliveries. The relic might be dipped in water for the woman to drink or laid across her belly. Whether it was divine intercession or the midwife's timing a safe delivery would be credited to both. Light joke 1. No refunds if the baby takes the scenic route. She shows you her birthing stool, a sturdy seat with a crescent cut out in the middle, worn smooth by years of use. The woman in labour sits with attendants on either side, the midwife in front and perhaps another behind to steady her back. A length of cloth is looped above so the mother can pull during contractions. The stool allows gravity to help, and in a small room, crowded with bodies, it's more practical than a bed. In a corner lies a basket of swaddling cloths and soft caps, along with a jar of honey for soothing the newborn's lips, and a pot of butter for easing the mother's soreness. A warmed stone is wrapped in flannel to rest against her feet. There's even a small knife blessed and sharpened for cutting the umbilical cord, its handle polished from years of service. Historians still argue over the exact role of midwives in regulating medical practice. Some were licensed by town authorities, others appointed informally by community trust, and some worked under scrutiny from church or civic officials who worried about magical charms or unorthodox prayers. The midwife here shrugs at such debates. She keeps what works, whether it comes from a medical text, her grandmother's hand, or a whispered tip from a travelling herbalist. She tells you about certain birthroom rules: open all cupboards and drawers to loosen the baby's path, untie knots in the mother's clothing and make sure no one crosses their arms, which might cross the birth. Quirky tidbit 2. In some places, an axe or knife would be placed under the bed to cut the pain or the cord of difficulty. Light joke 2. We don't use the bread knife too many crumbs. If a birth turns dangerous, the midwife may call for more heat stones, hot cloths, and for strong wine in small sips. She may send someone running for a priest to baptize the child as soon as its head appears if survival seems uncertain. For the mother, she might rub oil along her spine or chant a psalm in rhythm with her breathing. The room becomes its own small world where time is measured in contractions and every face is turned toward the same goal. On a shelf, you spot a small carved image of St. Margaret emerging from the belly of a dragon, a story the saint was said to have survived, making her a patron for safe childbirth. The midwife explains that some women carried her image on a ribbon around the neck during labour, believing it would help them escape difficulty. Light joke 3 slips in as she adds, "I can't promise you'll escape the gossip afterward, though." She unwraps a birthing girdle to show you the inscriptions, rows of crosses, prayers in looping Latin symbols that look like tiny ladders, steps to heaven or steps to the delivery. The parchment is soft at the edges, creased where it has been tied and untied dozens of times. She says some women prefer to keep it on for days after the birth to help close the body and guard against fever. After the birth, the midwife examines the child for breathing movement and strong colour, wrapping it snug and placing it in the mother's arms or in a cradle near the bed. She checks the mother for bleeding and offers warm broth laced with cinnamon or ale with an egg beaten in. The herbs in the room sage, rue chamomile serve double duty for the mother's recovery and for washing the newborn's skin. Historians still debate whether medieval midwives relied more on hands-on training or written instruction. Some surviving manuals mix detailed anatomical drawings with advice that reads like household law. What's clear from the way this midwife moves is that experience is her true textbook, each birth adding a paragraph to her memory. As you step outside, you catch the sound of a baby's first determined cry from somewhere down the lane. The midwife smiles knowingly, her hands already lifting another folded girdle from the shelf. The evening air feels warmer, now scented faintly with the herbs you've been carrying in your pouch, rue lavender mint, and under it all, the hum of a town where life begins in rooms filled with women's voices, quick hands, and the quiet courage to guide someone safely into the world. You walk toward the harbour where gulls stitch the air with slow, deliberate arcs, and the smell shifts from bread and hay to brine tar, and something faintly rotten that clings to ropes and hulls alike. Ships sit at anchor in the bay, their sails furled, while smaller boats weave between them, like children restless during chapel. At the quayside, a man in a patched coat waves a bundle of herbs in the direction of a gangplank, muttering as if the water itself might be listening. Mainstream fact in many medieval port towns controlling bad air and filth was considered as vital to health as medicine itself. Before germ theory, foul smells and visible dirt were blamed for spreading disease, and measures like sweeping streets, fumigating homes, and isolating newcomers were central to public health. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, 40 days the length of time ships were sometimes made to wait offshore before anyone could disembark. You find a watchman's booth at the dock gate, where a ledger lists vessels' origins, cargo, and notes on their health. A ship from the south, its crew reported sick, has been ordered to remain at anchor for the full 40 days. Supplies are ferried out, but no one steps ashore. It's a practice born from bitter experience with plague, give disease time to show itself before letting it into the city. Historians still argue whether the number 40 was chosen for symbolic reasons echoing biblical fasts and purifications, or whether it simply seemed long enough to cover the incubation of known illnesses. Along the quay, a group of men haul barrels of vinegar to a warehouse. Inside, the floor is scattered with rosemary, thyme and lavender, their scent pushed upward by his slow-burning braziers. Quirky tidbits from city orders required that streets be strewn with herbs and sprinkled with vinegar before major festivals to sweeten the air for the crowds. The effect was more perfumery than purification, but it gave people something to see, smell and believe in. Light joke 1. It also made the rats feel like they were living in a very upscale pantry. You step into a narrow lane where householders sweep doorways, tossing waste into carts rather than the gutter. A boy with a bundle of rue and mint offers sprigs to passers-by for a coin, swearing, "It will keep away fever wind." It's half street trade, half civic duty and curtima, encouraging people to carry their own pocket-sized air filters. You buy one, tucking it alongside your other herbs until your pouch smells like a walking garden. The lane opens into a small square where a group of women hang laundry on lines strung between poles. Clean linens flap like white flags in the sunlight. One explains that bedding and clothes from the sick are boiled in lye or vinegar before reuse. Another admits that sometimes the best they can do is leave them in the sun for days. The belief that light and fresh air could drive away sickness was strong and not entirely wrong, as modern hindsight would confirm. By the well, a city officer inspects a bucket of water, sniffing for rot or algae. He wears a badge and carries a long staff tipped with a brass knob, part symbol, part tool for knocking on doors without getting too close. He tells you about rules against slaughtering animals in the street, piling dung near homes, or letting stagnant water collect in barrels. Violators pay fines or are ordered to clean under supervision. Light joke 2, and if you argue they fine you again for wasting the clean air on complaints. Historians still argue whether these measures actually slowed epidemics or simply reassured the public. Many towns had regulations for street cleaning and waste removal well before plague arrived, but enforcement varied with resources and politics. In times of crisis, the rules tightened. In calmer years, they could slip until the smell reminded everyone why they existed. You pass a warehouse with its doors thrown open, inside walls whitewashed with lime, both a disinfectant and a visual sign of clean. Workers carry out bundles of rushes, replacing the floor, covering with fresh ones to sweep away dirt and odour. The rushes, once strewn on floors in homes and public halls, could hide filth if neglected, so changing them became part of household medicine. At the edge of the market, a man with a cart sells fumigation balls, small clay spheres packed with herbs and resin, to toss onto coals. He demonstrates by breaking one open over a brazier, releasing a cloud that smells like pine and smoke. Quirky tidbit 2. Some recipes for these balls included powdered ambergris or musk, ingredients more associated with perfume than pharmacy, ensuring that the cure was as fashionable as it was fragrant. Light joke 3. Because if you're going to cough, you might as well smell expensive doing it. A bell rings from the harbour gate announcing the arrival of a small boat from one of the quarantined ships. The men unloading barrels wear gloves and scarves over their faces. The watchman inspects the cargo and records it before it's taken to a shed apart from the main market. The process is slow, deliberate, less about efficiency, more about control. You realise that in this town, clean is a public performance as much as a private habit. By the time you loop back toward the main street, the sun has shifted enough to throw long shadows from the herb bundles hanging in doorways. The air feels sharper here, scented with vinegar, and something citrusy from a nearby pot. You think of the beaked doctor's fumigation rounds, the bathhouse steam, the monk's rosemary sprigs, all parts of the same story, keeping the invisible at bay with measures you can see and touch. As you step into the bustle of the market again, you pass a pair of children skipping in the street, their pockets stuffed with mint and marigolds. One holds a broom nearly twice her size, sweeping imaginary dust into the gutter. You can't help but think she's rehearsing for a role this town never stops casting. Everyone in some small way is part of the cleaning crew. You wander away from the harbour's salt and vinegar tang into a quieter lane, where houses lean toward each other, like conspirators. Here the noises are smaller. Creaking shutters, the faint strum of a lute, a dog sighing in its sleep. At the end of the lane you see a modest doorway with a sprig of rosemary, and a small wooden tablet marked with a cross. Inside, the air feels gentler, less about disinfecting and more about coaxing things, moods, thoughts rest back into place. This is where healers tend to troubles that live in the head as much as the body. Mainstream factor medieval medicine recognized melancholy as a condition caused by an excess of black bile in the humours, but the diagnosis was elastic stretching to cover sadness, anxiety, confusion, or what we'd now call mental illness. Treatment might involve diet, herbal remedies, prayer and conversation, what some called talking cures centuries before the phrase became fashionable. A woman in a russet gown greets you with a nod and a cup of warm, sweet wine infused with borage. To cheer the heart, she says, handing it over, as though it were a common courtesy like bread. She listens without hurry as you speak not about symptoms exactly, but about the way mornings feel heavier than nights, or how certain smells cling longer than they should. She nods, filing these details somewhere between her herb knowledge and her sense of the soul. Quirky tidbits, some healers advise playing specific instruments or songs for certain moods. Flute for calming the angry, harp for lightening sorrow, drum for stirring the lethargic. In royal courts, musical physicians were sometimes retained for just such purposes. Here the healer plucks a small harp, letting the notes float like slow bubbles in the warm air. Light joke 1, cheaper than a second leech and far less bitey. She offers a small loaf baked with fennel and anise, explaining that digestive troubles often travel with melancholy, and easing the stomach can ease the mind. Then she sets out a basin of lavender water for you to wash your hands and face the fragrance, claiming more of your attention than your thoughts do. She says some patients find comfort in confession, whether to a priest or a trusted layperson, and in the relief of speaking aloud what gnaws at them. Historians still argue whether such talking cures were considered medicine in their own right or merely a pleasant adjunct to more physical treatments. Surviving texts describe physicians asking patients about dreams, fears, and past griefs, then prescribing not just herbs but changes of scenery or company. The healer here clearly considers your conversation part of the work. She's dosing your mind alongside your body. On a shelf sit jars labelled for ailments, both bodily and emotional: rose syrup for gladdening the spirit, violet conserve for cooling, overheated thoughts, marjoram oil for headaches of the mind. There's a small phial of musk oil, too costly for most, which she says can fortify the brain when inhaled on a scrap of cloth. You imagine the beaked doctor stuffing a bit of musk in his mask, and decide that protection and comfort are often the same recipe in different wrapping. Quirky tidbit 2. One manuscript recommends setting the patient near an open fire and telling them amusing stories to heat the blood and dry the phlegm of sorrow. The healer chuckles at this and says her best comic material comes from the market, not the manuals. Light joke 2. You can't be sad when a goose steals a man's hat, trust me. I've tested this. She walks you into a small courtyard garden where rosemary, mint and sage grow in pots. The air is bright with bees. She says even a few minutes among green things can lift heaviness, especially if the patient tends the plants themselves. Work with the hands, she says, keeps the mind from chewing the same piece of worry over and over. Her remedies for melancholy follow the humoral map you've learned: warming, drying foods for those sunk in cold, moist gloom, cooling, moistening drinks for those scorched by restlessness and anger. She might advise gentle walks, avoiding loud company, and carrying certain scents, rosemary, lemon balm or rose petals in a pouch to sniff when sadness catches at the ribs. Historians still debate the overlap between treatments for melancholy and those for demonic possession. Some cases likely involved what we'd call mental illness today, others deep grief or trauma. In certain instances, the line between priest and physician blurred completely. Prayers were medicine, and medicine was a form of prayer. The healer here simply says that she treats what she sees, and sometimes what she sees is loneliness that has learned to wear the face of sickness. Light joke 3 arrives as she hands you a tiny pot of marjoram. Salve, rub it on your temples when the world feels too big or when your neighbour's singing does. You take it noting its grassy scent and the way your fingers smell calmer already. Before you leave, she gives you a slip of parchment with a verse to recite in the morning to set the day straight and a sprig of lemon balm to invite cheer. The pouch you carry now feels like a walking pharmacy rue: lavender, mint, rosemary, charms, girdles, wheels, and enough scents to keep bad air and bad moods second-guessing their welcome. As you step back into the lane, the sun has softened, and a breeze turns the rosemary sprig at your shoulder into a tiny flag. Somewhere the bathhouse steam rises for the evening crowd. Somewhere the barber's pole spins. Somewhere in the harbour a quarantined ship rocks gently counting its days. You breathe in lemon balm and realise the healer's parting gift has already begun to work. Your feet feel lighter, and so does the sky above them. You follow a dusty road that leaves the close-packed houses behind and opens into a patchwork of gardens, orchards and small farmyards. The air feels bigger here, and the chatter of the market fades into the sound of wind whirring at hedges. You've been in rooms of broth smoke music and murmured charms. Now you find yourself among the remedies people brew, bottle and carry with them on their own pilgrimages, whether to a shrine across the valley or just to the neighbour's hearth. Mainstream fact: in the Middle Ages, many people relied on home-prepared remedies and the exchange of small medicinal goods between neighbours. Pilgrims often returned from holy sites carrying both spiritual tokens and physical cures, bottles of holy water from well salves made by monks' herbal vinegars, part devotional souvenir, part travelling pharmacy. Your first stop is a small roadside stall under a canvas awning, where a woman sells jars of honey mixed with powdered cinnamon. Good for the chest, she says, and sweet enough to make you want more. The honey is from her own hives, the cinnamon brought upriver by traders. She also offers vinegar steeped with sage and garlic meant to guard against bad air in crowded towns. You imagine the beaked doctor nodding at the recipe's familiarity. On a bench nearby, a man is rolling bandages from strips of old linen, dipping them in a jar of wine for storage. Quirky tidbit: some households kept a wound pot in the kitchen, a small container of melted wax resin and herbs that could be warmed and applied in emergencies. It wasn't sterile by the modern standards, but it was ready, and in a world without chemists on every street, readiness counted. Light joke 1. Just don't mistake it for pie filling. In a cottage garden, you watch a woman gathering marigold blossoms into her apron. She dries them for teas against fevers, the petals also used to tint butter or cheese. On her porch, a pot of comfrey root steeps in oil, making a salve for sore joints. She shows you a small wax tablet covered in scrawled recipes, half cooking, half carved curing passed down from her grandmother. Historians still argue how much of this folk medicine was independent of learned medicine, and how much was shared knowledge flowing up and down the social ladder. What's clear is that the remedies themselves travel well: vinegar and herbs in stoppered flasks, dried roots tied in cloth-powdered spices tucked into waxed paper. On the road ahead, a group of pilgrims approaches their cloaks, dusty staffs marked with badges from shrines. One carries a gourd sloshing with water from a holy well. Another has a pouch of dried petals blessed at a chapel. They trade these items as they walk along with stories of where they came from. Quirky tidbit too: some pilgrims rubbed their badges on ailing limbs or brewed them briefly in wine to transfer the shrine's virtue into the drink. Whether it cured or not, it made the act of drinking feel like part of a larger journey. Light joke 2. The vintage is questionable, but the marketing is divine. You stop at a small inn where the hostess offers you a steaming mug of ale posset milk, curdled with ale and sweetened with honey, touted as a cure for chills and a tonic for long walks. She presses into your hand a folded scrap of paper with a local remedy for night cough, thyme boiled in wine, strained and sweetened. She tells you to tuck the paper into your pouch so the words themselves can guard the lungs. Outside, a boy sells little twists of cloth filled with dried mint and rose petals meant to be dropped into the washing water or slipped under a pillow. He claims they keep nightmares away. You buy one, and it joins the jumble of scents already travelling with you rue from the infirmary, lavender from the soporific room, lemon balm from the healer's garden. Historians still debate whether these small portable remedies were more effective for the body or the mind. In an age when journeys were long and illness unpredictable, the ability to carry even the idea of a cure may have been as important as the cure itself. Pilgrim flasks and amulet pouches offered reassurance you could hold in your hand. In the last house before the road bends out of sight, an old man sits carving small wooden spoons. He sells them for kitchen use, but quietly adds that a spoon carved from elderwood keeps food honest and discourages ill humours. He offers you one for a coin and you take it, because by now you've learned that refusing a charm is worse luck than carrying too many. Light joke 3. Besides, you can always use another spoon. The road winds upward, and from the crest you can see the town behind you. The harbour dotted with anchored ships, the barber's striped pole turning faintly in the breeze, the cloister garden's green square, the steeple sheltering its reliquary. Each place, each person added something to your pouch or your mind: a spice, a story, a scent, a fragment of belief. You realise you've been gathering more than objects. You've collected the ways people here meet illness with whatever they have. Steel stars, smoke, leaves, charms, or a kind word. It's not one science, but many small ones braided with hope. And as the light softens, the road ahead feels less like escape and more like carrying their remedies forward, whether or not you ever need to use them. You keep walking. As the sun slides toward the rim of the fields, its light thinning into the gentler gold that makes even crooked fences look composed. Your steps slow without you asking them to. The air itself seems to be urging quiet. Somewhere far behind a bell counts the hour in a voice too soft to reach you clearly. The scents from your pouch herbs, flowers, a hint of vinegar, rise and mingle with the smell of earth cooling after day. Each breath feels longer, each exhale softer. You think about the people you've met: the monk with his broth and warm stone, the barber with his steady hands, the bathhouse attendant and her river physicians, the beaked doctor, sifting air through cloves, the physician reading, weather in glass, the astrologer timing, care to the moon's mood, the gardener monk with his leaves and roots, the surgeon coaxing sleep from a sponge, the trepan man with his careful drill, the priest guarding a relic's hush, the midwife smoothing her birthing girdle, the watchman patrolling clean air, the healer coaxing heavy thoughts into lighter ones, and there's pilgrims trading faith and salves like currency. The road ahead dips into shadow lined with trees whose leaves are already whispering tomorrow's weather. You let the weight of the day drain from your shoulders, not suddenly, but like water soaking into thirsty ground. Your eyelids feel as if they've learned the language of these leaves, heavy but not burdened. The evening wraps you without tightening, and for the first time since stepping into this strange, careful town, you realise you've stopped measuring the air for harm. The remedies, the charms, the strange and sometimes unsettling rituals there are all behind you now, folded into the small archive you carry in your mind. Out here, the hum is only the wind, and it's the sort of wind that doesn't want to cure you so much as keep you company. You find a spot by the roadside, sit with your back against a tree and close your eyes. Somewhere a bee makes its last lazy circuit of the day. The warmth at your feet is just the sun, and it stays until it doesn't. You feel the cool arriving and welcome it, because it means you're already somewhere safe enough to sleep.